Okay, hi everybody. I think maybe we'll get started. If people want to come in later, that's fine. Welcome to our Pre-Purim Shiur, where the title of the shiur tonight is "The Day After: Lessons about how to move on after Haman's defeat." Notice that the word Haman is only one letter difference from the modern enemy of Hamas. So that's interesting, right? Um, there are a number of things that I wanted to share with you tonight that I feel that I don't want. First of all, I don't think it's appropriate to spoon feed uh, correlations that are, A to A, B to B correlations with what's happening in the world today. I think that there are many commonalities, many things that the Purim story can share about what's going on in the world today. And I want to be able to maybe provide a few breadcrumbs and then have you fill in the blanks and find your own trail. But before we do that, I think a couple of prefatory remarks are necessary. The Mishnah, this was what our Rav Mata Frank had said a couple of weeks ago at Shalosh Shudas. It's a vort from the Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon. The Mishnah says, "Hakoreyat HaMegillah lemafreya lo yatsa." If a person reads the Megillah out of order, that's what the word lemafreya literally means. If you read it backwards, you're not yotze. You have to read it in sequential order in order to be able to appreciate that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that the hand of Hashem was with us every step of the way. But the Baal Shem Tov used to say that there's a deeper meaning. HaKoreyat HaMegillah lemafreya, he writes, and this is in source number 1 in your handout, Amar Hari Besht, that the Baal Shem Tov used to say that HaKoreyat HaMegillah lemafreya perush shesover ki az haya hanes velo ata, is if a person believes that the miracle was lemafreya back then, backwards. Only looking backwards was there a miracle. But there are no miracles of Purim today. If that's the only thing that you get out of the Megillah is to read a historical episode of Jewish history, lo yatza, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. Because the obligation is to be able to take the lessons of the story of the Megillah and apply them to our lives right now, especially during a time of Haman, substitute the N for the S, then you can very easily find correlations between the Purim story and today. There's another point that I wanted to bring out, and this is from a tshuva from Reb Sadia Gaon. In one of the Sfarim that brings Tshuvot HaGeonim, the responsa from the Gaonates who lived before the 10th century, between the close of the Talmud and before the 10th century, the question that the Vilna Gaon, that the Reb Sadia Gaon rather was asked is, V'yesh she'ela lama lo nichtav Hashem b'Megillah hazot? Why is God's name missing from the Megillah? Now, you're probably familiar with the popular answer. I don't even know where this originates, but it's an answer that everyone gives. What's the popular answer?
There's king and king.
Oh, because the word Hamelech is an allusion for God. But that doesn't really answer the question, Paul. It doesn't answer the question as to why. Hashem, that's the answer. Hello. It's because Hashem is hidden. It's because God was hidden throughout the story. You could have read the story as being just a series of coincidences that resulted in the Jews' good fortune. And the challenge of life is that when you're experiencing Hester Panim, to find God nonetheless peering through the lattices, as Shir Hashirim says. But that's not what Reb Sadia says. Reb Sadia Gaon gives a different answer. He says, "V'hareb Sadia heshiv ki hamelech tziva leMordechai sheichtov haMegillah v'yatikuha bilashon paras b'sefer divrei hayamim." He says this Megillah that we have in our possession was originally not a Hebrew document. It was originally a document that was written in Farsi. V'ilu haya kotev shem Hashem, hayu haparsim mechalfim oto b'shem avodah zarah. And the reason that Mordechai did not write God's name in this document is because he knew that if he presented this historical document saying that God saved the Jews, the Persians would have taken the name of their god, some Zoroaster, Tammuz or whatever the name of that god would be. They probably had multiple gods, and they would place that name in the Persian annals instead of the Shem Hashem. And so, because of that, Mordechai deliberately left out God's name so as not to allow the name of an idolatry to be associated with the Jewish people in some foreign language, in some foreign land of the diaspora. That's a mind-blowing concept, because what that essentially tells you is that this Megillah that was canonized by our sages and made a part of Tanakh was actually originally a secular document in a different language. And it was later, and it was not meant as holy writ. It was meant to be a document of record for the historical annals of the Persian Empire. Okay? And later, the rabbis, in consultation with Mordechai and Esther, decided that they would translate this Persian document into Hebrew and make it part of Holy Scriptures. This is not me speaking. This is not my chidush. I don't think I'd have the chutzpah to suggest such a thing. This is what Reb Saadia Gaon says. Now, if that's the case, then when Mordechai was writing this, even though he may have intended this to later become part of the Holy Scriptures, of part of Tanakh, but understand that he's writing a historical document for the kingdom of Persia. And therefore, we have to, at least one way of reading the Megillah is look at it as a historical record of what the Jews of the time wanted the world to learn from this story, so that Jews, future generations of Jews who would go through diaspora iterations, would be able to learn lessons of how to survive in the diaspora when we have ascendancy over our enemies and how to comport ourselves. Okay? Now, it's in this vein, the reason why I call this shiur the day after is because we find ourselves in a situation today where we are more increasingly asking the question, what's the end game of this war? As the war begins to wind down, we still have our 50 hostages in Gaza that we still are fighting to get out. We still have soldiers on the borders. We still have soldiers in Lebanon. We still have soldiers in Gaza. But the fighting has diminished. Hamas is on the retreat. Hezbollah has been defeated. There is a new regime in Syria, as problematic as that is. We don't have to go into that now. But things seem to have changed dramatically from the place where we were a year ago when we were in the midst of war with Amalek. And now, what seems to me to be appropriate is not to look at the main story of the war against Haman, but rather to look at the aftermath of Haman's demise, of Haman's defeat, and to see what the aftermath of that story is, what the day after is. Because the Megillah does not end with the hanging of Haman. That's the end of Perek Zion of the 7th chapter of a 10-chapter Megillah. And the question is, what lessons should we take from chapters 8, 9, and 10 to apply to what's going on in our times today? And so that's my exercise for this evening. I hope you find it of value. And so I mentioned before some of you came in, if you'd like to, I'm going to give you a synopsis of the events that took place in chapters 8, 9, and 10, just giving a synopsis of the psukim. If you prefer to read it in Hebrew from a chumash, we have plenty of chumashim here, and the Megillah is in the back of the chumash. But let's go through just a brief synopsis of what's happening in chapters 8, 9, and 10. Achashverosh gives Esther control over Beit Haman. Beit Haman is the Haman estate. Okay? Esther reveals that Mordechai is her kin. Achashverosh gives his ring to Mordechai, in effect making him his prime minister. And Esther gives Mordechai control over Beit Haman. Esther requests a rescission of the edict against the Jews. Achashverosh, explaining that he cannot rescind a royal edict, instead tells Esther that the Jews should assemble on the 13th of Adar, which will take place months from now, and that permission is granted to them to exact vengeance from their enemies. Meaning, I can't tell the anti-Semites not to attack you, but if they lift up weapons, you can go up and smite them first, and you'll be able to have help from the government, will arm you and will provide you with munitions and soldiers and so forth. The runners, who are in charge of sending out the second edict, receive the message in a confused state and hurriedly convey the announcement, and the law is stabilized in Shushan. Mordechai emerges from Achashverosh's palace with royal garb, and upon hearing the king's new edict, the Jews throughout Persia rejoice. And so it was that on the 13th of Adar, the Jews took vengeance upon their enemies, and no one raised a hand against them, since they all feared the Jews. In Shushan, the Jews killed 500 anti-Semites. Haman's 10 sons were included in these casualties, and no one took their spoils. This was ostensibly to demonstrate that we are not doing this for financial gain. We are doing this to repel the enemies of the Jews purely. Achashverosh notes the casualties in Shushan and asks Esther what else she would like to see done. Esther responds, "Give us tomorrow as well in Shushan to wreak vengeance and hang Haman's 10 sons' corpses." Achashverosh acquiesces. The Jews in Shushan continue to kill their enemies on the 14th of Adar, an additional 300 in Shushan. Meanwhile, the Jews in the rest of Persia execute their enemies on the 13th, a total of 75,000 people. That's a huge number, many more than the casualties in Gaza. They too did not take any spoils. In Persia, they rested and rejoiced on the 14th, whereas in Shushan, they rested and rejoiced on the 15th, because in Shushan, the carnage was continuing on the 14th. Okay? So this is why, now we're in the midst of chapter 9. Okay? This is why there are 2 days of Purim, one for walled cities like Shushan and one for the unwalled cities like the rest of Persia. Part of the celebration is Mishloach Manot, each person to his friend. Mordechai sent letters with an edict to all Jewish communities telling them to accept Purim celebrations, including Mishloach Manot and Matanot Levionim, for all future generations. All Jews accepted the edict. Because Haman had used lots to plan for the Jews' destruction and his plan was overturned, this is why the Purim holiday was established and called Purim to remind us of his plot. The Jews all accepted this as a perpetual holiday in every generation and in every community. These days of Purim can never be eliminated or forgotten. In order to ensure that Purim would gain traction, Esther repeated the sending out of letters the following year, and thus was the Megillah written down for all perpetuity. And according to Rebbe Sadja, that's when the Megillah was translated from Persian into Hebrew. Achashverosh, apparently very successful, succeeded in imposing taxes upon provinces both near and far, and all of Achashverosh's exploits and the rise to power of Mordechai, his prime minister, are all recorded in the Persian annals. Mordechai, too, was very popular among his fellow Jews and always sought their welfare. And that's how the Megillah ends. I submit to you, what would the Megillah not have been complete without any of this aftermath of the story? If the main villain, the one that we bang for, is Haman, why not just stop with the defeat of Haman and basically say, and Achashverosh took the side of the Jews, and they lived happily ever after in Persia. End scene, the end, credits roll, and the story is over. Fade to black, and the story is over. Okay, and so here are some questions. So that's our overarching question, of course. And here are some just basic questions from the events of chapters 8, 9, and 10. There are many more questions that one might ask. These are just the questions that jumped out at me. I would welcome the questions that jump out at you. So I have a total, I think I put down 9 questions. So we understand why Esther is given control over Haman's estate. Why is it relevant that she gave that control over to Mordechai? Next, what are we to learn from the fact that Achashverosh could not rescind his original decree? Furthermore, why is that an important part of the story? Okay, furthermore, what difference does it make if Achashverosh contradicts himself via rescinding a decree versus sending out a second decree which contradicts the first? If the concern is that Achashverosh is worried about the anarchy that would ensue should he give 2 conflicting instructions to his subjects, what difference does it make if he retracts the original decree or if he gives a second decree that contradicts the first decree. The net result is people in Persia are going to be scratching their heads. What kind of crazy king is this? First day he tells us kill the Jews, and the second day he tells us kill the enemies of the Jews. Okay. Another question that we might ask is, why does Achashverosh essentially tell Esther and Mordechai to do as they wish to the anti-Semites? Like, he doesn't even care. And here I have to tell you, I was very struck by the similarities to the current events. Because not to suggest that Donald Trump is Achashverosh. I think Achashverosh was much more foolish than Donald Trump, or perhaps the other way around, depending upon which party you are in favor of. But there are definitely similarities between the two. And if you'll notice, Trump basically told the world that this is my plan for Hamas. Let's get rid of them completely. But it's up to Israel. Do with them as you wish. Yeah, Katov be'einechem, b'shem hamelech. As it says in the Megillah, do what is good in your eyes in the name of the king, in the name of Donald J. Trump. Okay. So that to me jumped out at me this year. I don't know about you. Okay. Next, what is the significance of the runners being dispatched in a confused and hurried state? Like, why does the Megillah make a point of saying that? Next question, E. We can appreciate the morale boost of executing Haman's 10 sons, but why does Esther wish to have their corpses publicly hanged? Next, why did Esther request an additional day for killing all the Shushan enemies? Why in general was the vengeance against the anti-Semites so complete and bloody? I don't know if we're going to be able to answer all of these questions thoroughly, but let's see what we can come up with. Next, why is the hallmark of Purim Mishloach Manot and Matanot le'Evyonim? Like, that doesn't seem to have any place in the story itself. It's a day of celebration, but why specifically Mishloach Manot and Matanot le'Evyonim? What does that have to do with their salvation from the wicked Haman and other anti-Semites? Next, why is the holiday called Purim? Because of Haman's lots. What do his lots have to do with the miracle of the story of the Jews' salvation? Just because he drew lots? Like, that's not even an integral part of the story. He just needed to come up with a date. So he figured, let me roll the dice, so to speak. So, like, if Haman had rolled dice, would we call the holiday of Purim dice? It's like lahavdil. They say that if Yeshu Hanotzri would have been executed in the 20th century, Christians would be wearing an electric chair around their neck. So in other words, you sort of have to ask yourself the question, why do we name the holiday after just a game of chance that Haman played? Okay.
I'm learning the humor at the moment. We're doing the section on the lots, where the Kohanim put their fingers out. The lots there are called payot. They're not called Purim.
They're called, what are they called?
Payot, I think.
That doesn't sound right. But anyway, you'll show me the Gemara later. But there are lots that we do all the time. There's the Seir La'azazel as well. They're called Goralot, I think, in the Torah. Why is Achashverosh's success, as witnessed by his taxation of all of his provinces, deemed to be an important part of the story? And that's really where the Megillah ends. Chapter 10, if you ask me, adds nothing relevant to the story of Purim. It just basically tells us about the exploits of a successful king, and that his minister was Mordechai, and that he was always seeking out the welfare of his brethren. It's a lovely way to end the story, but it seems to be contributing nothing to the texture and the substance of the story. Okay. So I'm going to start, like I said, the purpose of our shiur tonight is to offer just a few breadcrumbs. And then at the end of the shiur, what I wanted to do is just to offer you some ideas to contemporize some lessons of the Purim story to what's going on today. I already told you about the Katov be'einechem, do whatever you want to the people of Hamas, but I have more of those kinds of little tidbits. So first of all, in order to answer our question, why is it significant that Achashverosh is giving Esther control of Haman's estate, and then Esther gives that over to Mordechai? So we have the Malbim has such a wonderful commentary on the Megillah, and he tells us that whenever a king conquers a province or a piece of territory, that territory is immediately confiscated by the person who has been defeated by the king. This was typical not only of a king confiscating someone, a mutineer's property, but if two nations went to war with each other, it was quite typical for the losing nation to abdicate ownership of their land, and they would be exiled. This is typical of the history of war, and essentially what Achashverosh was demonstrating was that when he gave over this property to Esther, he wanted to publicly demonstrate that he wasn't confiscating Haman's property for self-gain. He didn't need Haman's property. He was concerned about the honor that was due to his queen and her people. And when he discovered, as it's written in Perek Zayin in chapter 7 of the Megillah, that Haman wanted to exterminate Esther and her entire family, her entire people, he wanted to confiscate the property and award it to her. Esther, in turn, gave it over to Mordechai as a way of showing, because Mordechai represents the Jewish people, that the Jewish people, instead of being exterminated by Haman, were actually awarded their enemies' land. Okay? Whether that has significance to modern times, we'll talk about that later on. So that's an answer to one of our questions. Now, as far as rescinding the decree versus sending out a new decree, here's another interesting commentary of the Malbim. And he, in one of his answers to this question, what difference does it make? He says, the wisdom of Achashverosh he says, I can't contradict or rescind the decree that I've already given. That's going to create a lack of stability in the government. It's going to create a lack of confidence in the people, and it could destabilize my authority. So rather, what you need to do is to issue a second decree that will not contradict the first decree, but will rather explain it in a different light. And as the Malbim explains, the original edict was lahashmid, laharog, ula'abed et kol haYehudim, to destroy, to kill, and to cause total loss to all the Jews. Now, many of the commentaries point out that the three verbs, lahashmid, laharog, ula'abed, why do you need all three verbs? Because Haman's objective was not to commit necessarily a complete genocide of all the Jews, but was to rather to kill the men, to despoil the women, and to take the children and make them his slaves, and to confiscate all the property. So therefore, laharog is there, but also lahashmid and la'abed is to also not, even when not killing a people, you can completely demoralize them and subjugate them to the point where they'd lose any sense of national identity and pride. Now, there's another way that you could read that, and this is sort of like the old joke where a guy is with his fishing rod fishing off the side of the pier, and there's a big sign that says no fishing. And so the fellow that's in charge of the licenses for gaming and hunting comes over to the fellow and says, don't you realize you're not allowed to fish here? And the guy says, what are you talking about? He says, can't you read the sign? And he says, takes a marker and puts out a comma after the no and says, no, fishing. And instead of saying no fishing allowed, it says no fishing allowed. So there would have been a way, especially in the Persian language, which I'm not fluent in, or I'm not conversant in, that you could have read this sentence of lahashmid laharogu la'abed, that the edict was to destroy and eliminate, and who would be doing the eliminating? Kol haYehudim. Kol haYehudim. In other words, that you could, sometimes you put the action before the subject, and sometimes you put the subject before the action. Since the original edict did not state who was going to be doing the destroying, you could have read as haYehudim instead of being the object as being the subject. And therefore, in order to clarify, Mordechai and Esther came up with a second edict that clarified. And it said, that the way that you read it is lahashmid laharog et kolchel amu bedina hatzarim otam, that the new edict was to destroy and exterminate all who were oppressing the Jews. And who was going to be doing that? Ha-Yehudim. Okay, so now it's clarified that Yehudim is not the object of the extermination, but they are the subject of the extermination. And Hatzarim Otam, those who are oppressing them, are the object. And so that was the ploy that Achashverosh wanted to use. He said, you've got to figure out a way where you're not contradicting the first edict, but you're clarifying what it really means. Now, that's a bit of a stretch, but at the same time, when you see what some politicians today are able to do to parse their words, you can imagine that this doesn't stretch the limits of incredulity, because politicians speak like this all the time. So, and also, you have to also remember the big difference that we're dealing with in the United States today is that instead of having to contradict a prior edict and weakening the stability of the country, when you have a democratically elected regime that changes every 4 years, you can basically say the previous president was an idiot and the worst president who ever lived, and he made terrible, terrible mistakes. And now we're going to completely overturn everything that he did in order to steer the country in the right direction. And so whereas the previous president was holding back support of the Jewish people and actually giving aid, either whether overtly or covertly, to the enemies of the Jews using USAID or and other vehicles, UNRWA and so forth, we're now going to change that entire thing. So in this sense, modern events are different from what happened then, but it still shows you a creative way of completely reversing the previous rules in order to fit the new narrative. Okay, next question we had. The runners being dispatched in a confused and hurried state. So here you have a commentary from the Alshich, and a number of other Meforshim say this as well. If you look carefully at the language of the Megillah, you're going to discover that there are two types of messages. One type of message is dispatched to the people of Shushan, and another type of message was dispatched to all the other provinces throughout Persia. And as the Alshich says in his running commentary throughout the Megillah, the message that Haman dispatched to all of the different provinces throughout Persia was a sealed message only to be opened on the 13th of Adar. And the reason why is perhaps he was concerned that this would be terrible PR for the country if people were to discover that they were going to exterminate all the Jews in the country, because all of the bleeding heart liberals would have said, you can't do this, and there could have created a civil war. But in Shushan itself, this was an open edict that was advance notice was given months ahead of the 13th of Adar, that on the 13th of the Adar, it's free, open game on the Jews. And so the anti-Semites were drooling and just at the mouth to be able to have this opportunity for the 13th of Adar to arrive. And the concern was that if we allow this edict to remain unchallenged until the 13th of Adar, at least the enemies in Shushan would want to get a head start on all of the revelry and the murder and the mayhem that was supposed to take place on the 13th. So it's for that reason that the runners had to run quickly in order to at least stop the people in Shushan, the capital city, from doing anything to harm the Jews. Okay, in order to answer the question as to why Haman's sons were first executed and then hanged, most of the commentaries of the story understand, contrary to what I used to think. I used to think that just like they hanged Haman as a method of execution, they also hanged Haman's 10 sons, took them off the gallows, and Esther said, would you mind putting them back up on the gallows? That's why I always understood the story. But if you read the story carefully in the text of the Megillah, that's not what it actually says. It says they killed the 10 sons of Haman, which usually implies death by the sword. And then Esther said, here's my request. Instead of just allowing them to be quietly executed in the battlefield or in their homes, please let me take their corpses and hang them on the gallows next to their father's rotting corpse in order to be able to make an example out of them. The Ralbag explains that the reason why Esther asked for this gruesome image to be displayed in public is kedei sheyiru ha'anashim hanotarim la'asot kain, is so that any other anti-Semites that would be remaining in Shushan would see that this is what happens to the enemies of the Jews, and this would disincentivize them from coming out to attack. This was part of the strategy, in addition to the runners that were sent out to send out the next message to prevent any kind of confrontation between the anti-Semites and the Jews. Now, what's interesting, and this is something that the commentaries point out, is that Esther's request to hang the 10 sons of Haman and keep them hanging there for some significant amount of time seems to fly in the face of an explicit commandment in the Torah. Because the Torah says that you have to treat a human body with dignity. Do you know what I'm talking about? There's a mitzvah in the Torah, in Parshas Ki Teitzei, that says, V'chi yeh v'ish chet mishpat mavet v'humat, v'talita oto al eitz. That if a person has committed a sin for which the penalty is capital punishment, then you shall take his body after he is executed and hang him on a tree for public display. However, the Torah says that can only be for a limited amount of time. Lo talin nivlato al ha'etz. You may not keep his corpse hanging for any extended period of time. Ki kavor tikperenu bayom hahu. By the end of the day, you must remove the body and bury him. Ki kilalat elokim talui. Because the curse of God is there hanging. What does that mean, the curse of God is hanging? If you allow a person's body to just be out there swaying in the wind, it's a disgrace not only to that person's body, but it's also a disgrace to Hashem, because every human being was created in God's image. So, and thereby you will not defile the land that God is giving you. So the question, of course, that a lot of the Meforshim ask is that Esther, being a nice, from Beis Yaakov girl, what right did she have to request for the Torah to be violated and hang these people in state in the way that she did? So there are a number of answers. One, of course, is you could say, well, it was pikuach nefesh. She did it in order to save Jewish lives, because otherwise there would not have been sufficient deterrence for the enemies. You could also say that if you look at the pasuk carefully, it says, "V'lo tetamei et admatecha," do not defile your land by hanging a corpse overnight, which means that it might only apply in Eretz Yisrael and not in Chutz La'aretz. But there's a very, very fascinating answer that I saw in a sefer from Rav David Cohen called Sefer Ohel David. And he writes, and we'll read this together. It's in section D. Let me just scroll down here so that the people watching this online can see it. He says, Ve'ala b'rayoni lomar milta chadeta. I thought to perhaps suggest a chiddush, a new idea. Sheba Amalek lo shayach isur halanat hamet. That with Amalek, who was such a sworn enemy of God, there is no reason to worry about God being cursed by having their body hanging out. Shenovea mimasha kilalat elokim talui. And why is there no worry that Amalek will contribute to the cursing of God? Because of the disgrace of their corpses. Mekiven she'ein Hashem shalem ad she'yimacheh zar'a shel Amalek, ein betliato mishum kilalat elokim. Because God's name cannot be complete until Amalek is completely exterminated. So Amalek represents the antithesis of God. So the idea here is that even though any normal human being's body to be displayed like that would be an affront to God, because every person is created in God's image, but because Amalek so deeply represents that which is antithetical to Hashem, God is not being disgraced by leaving out the body, but instead God's name is being exalted in that process. Make of that what you will, but at least it explains how sometimes when an enemy does something that is so heinous that they lose their humanity, that the rules of humanity no longer apply to those individuals. That's, of course, a very dangerous doctrine if it's taken out of context, but I wanted to share that with you.
Thinking something else.
Go ahead,
I was
Shlomi.
at a visitation yesterday, Catholic visitation. They display the body. It's lying there in a suit, open
Lying in
casket,
state,
those
yeah.
beads on his arms.
Mhm.
So big. It's like they're Muslim.
Maybe that's the answer, is that because the Goyim themselves are moichel. But the only problem that I have with that is that the Torah is concerned about God's honor. So you can't be moichel on God's honor. In other words, I'm saying if we were to explain to a Catholic, a good Catholic, I understand that this is your tradition, but in our tradition, what you're doing is disgracing God by doing that. Maybe they would take that to heart. I don't know. Okay. Why the vengeance was so bloody, 75,000 casualties plus the 800 that were in Shushan, so nearly 76,000 casualties throughout Persia, is the Ralbag makes an interesting point. Why did Esther ask for a second day of exterminating the enemies in Shushan? It says that on the 13th of Adar, they wiped out 500 anti-Semites. And Achashverosh comes to Esther and he says, anything else? Can I do anything else for you? And she says, yes, let's exterminate the anti-Semites throughout Persia, not just in the capital city. And plus, give us one more day to finish the job in Shushan. When they killed on the next day, they killed an additional 300 in Shushan. So what was Esther's bloodlust all about? And here again, the Ralbag just says, Al pi hapshat, uve'et asher haya le'el yadam, hishtadlu lechalotam. The reason why Esther, when she saw that the Jews had the upper hand, wanted to wipe out the additional enemies, pen yihiu lahem lekotzim b'ameh sheyavo mehazman mipnei ma shehifligu Yisrael b'hashchatatam. He says, because Esther knew that whatever enemies of the Jews remained after this day of revenge, of vengeance, would only come back even worse and try to avenge their honor that they had suffered such an ignoble defeat. And it was for that reason that Esther said, we need to wipe them all out. Or like Nikki Haley said, finish them. In other words, we need to finish them, because if we don't finish them, then they're only going to come back with a vengeance. And that, of course, certainly has parallels to what's going on today as well. You'll recall, however, I just want to remind you all, I did mention on Shabbos that the commandment to wipe out men, women, children, and animals was a sui generis command, a unique command that only pertained to King Saul and not to any future generation. So when we talk about finishing them, we're not talking about finishing the women, the children, and the animals. We're talking about finishing all the combatants, all the sworn enemies of the Yahud, okay? Why is it a day of Mishloach Manot and Matanot LeEvyonim? And so you have some beautiful commentaries from the Alshich and the Megillat Starim. When you put them together, what comes out is that there's a concern that the Jews recognized that they were being punished because of some flaw within their national entity. In fact, Haman was correct by calling the Jews an am mefuzar u'meforad bein ha'amim, a nation that is scattered and disparate among your people. The Jews were not united. And as a matter of fact, when they first heard the edict that the Megillah describes, that was Avel ubechi umisped, that there was mourning, there was crying, and there was eulogizing. And the Alshich points out, why do you need all of those terminologies? And he explains that Avel and Bechi, mourning and crying, is something that a person can do as an individual. You don't need to join with others in order to marinate in your misery. But Hesped is something that you do as a community. And this was really the goal, was really to get the Jews to unite in their misery, and also when that misery would pass, to have them unite in their rejoicing in their victory. And so in order for that to be accomplished, it was necessary for the rabbis of the time to encourage Bnei Israel to feel like we were one people. And that is why this is the ultimate rectification of what got us into trouble in the first place. Okay, I'm going to come back to that at the end of the shiur. And finally, just to finish off, one more, oh no, I have two more points that I wanted to make, which is, one is, why is this called a day of lots? And why is this something that is relevant to the story to call Purim, like if Haman had used dice, we would have called this the day of dice. So the Sfas Emes and a number of other commentaries explain as follows. When lots are drawn, like Peter was talking about the lots that they took in the temple, or that there were lots that were taken on Yom Kippur to decide which goat was for Hashem and which goat was for Azazel. This was not, the command was not to tell the Jews, do everything by chance. The idea of taking lots is to basically say, let us see what God decrees should be the natural order of things. That's what lots basically does. It means that the normative way that Hashem would run the universe would be to allow for the destruction of the Jews on the 13th of Adar. And what ended up happening is that Hashem reversed the natural order for the sake of Bnei Israel by reversing the lottery that was the evil lottery that was for the Jews and taking that evil lottery and placing it instead upon Haman. The Sfas Emes says that's the reason why the day is called Purim in the plural and not Pur, because when you think about it, Al Kain Kara Layamim Ha'ele Purim Al Shem Hapur. That's what the Megillah says. That's the reason why this day is called Purim, to commemorate the Pur, the lottery in the singular. Why not call it Pur, and why is it called Purim? And the answer is that Hashem took two of the lots, the lot of Haman and the lot of Bnei Israel, and reversed them, so that what the natural order indicated should have happened to Haman to gain ascendancy, and the lottery for the Jew, or the lots for the Jewish people that should have been defeat and destruction, was reversed. The two lots were reversed. So what was meant for Haman went for the Jewish people, and was meant for the Jewish people went instead to Haman. And that, the name Purim amplifies the miracle, because it's indicative of the fact that God completely subverted the order of the universe, the stars and the mazel and everything else that was supposed to play out. Hashem completely inserted himself into teva, into nature, and completely subverted it and reversed it, as if he would have reversed the motion of the sun. And finally, Achashverosh's success, just to answer one more question, we look at the Maharal, who talks about the idea that the Megillah wishes to end with pointing out to us that you might have thought that Achashverosh sticking his neck out for the Jews might have caused a strain in his power base. It might have caused people to think, well, who is Trump? Is he a Jew lover or is he a Persian lover? And people might have suspected that he might have dual loyalties, and he's placing his affinity for his queen above, his concern for America. Like there were certain people who thought that because Ivanka was married to a Jew, Trump was doing all of these things, moving the embassy to Jerusalem and so forth and so on, right? So the end of the Megillah wants to observe that Achashverosh never lost any of his power as a result of sticking his neck out for the Jews. If anything, he gained more power because people were able to observe how swiftly and quickly and decisively he eliminated Haman as being a traitor. And that is a signal for future generations that Jews should not be intimidated to stand up for themselves when they are in the diaspora. Don't think that you'll be accused of sedition or of having dual loyalties because you are proud of your Judaism and you're proud of the Jewish people and the Jewish people's state of Israel. Just to the contrary, any leader who stands up with the Jews will end up having his power base strengthened instead of compromised. And it could also be an indication that it was because Mordechai was his prime minister that he was so successful by the end of the story, because every good president needs a Henry Kissinger in order to be able to succeed. And that's also part of the lesson of, maybe it's a lesson for the Persians more than it is a lesson for the Jews, but the lesson for the Jews would be is that there have been Jews who have been needed throughout Jewish history to occupy important places within government. We know that the Abarbanel was the royal vizier to the king or not the vizier, he was one of the ministers to King Ferdinand for a certain period of time, and then he went to Portugal, and also was a high-ranking official. And we know that there were many other great Jews who held high posts within government, not holding the highest post, of course, because that is too much attention, but being the puppeteer behind the screen and being able to move things along that will be both in favor of the country and in favor of the Jewish people is something that is a proud tradition that dates back to the times of Mordechai. Okay, and so that therefore concludes some of the lessons that we can answer from the Megillah story itself. Now, I want to offer just two additional reflections in addition to what we've already talked about, how to apply these lessons to the modern day. As I said, I'm just going to leave out some breadcrumbs, and I ask you to do the rest of the work on yourself. Just some reflections on what is happening today. Regarding the connection of the confiscation of Haman's estate to what is happening today, you have a link in your notes to an article from the Free Beacon, which was written by a professor named Andrew Roberts. I became exposed to this gentleman. He's a Gentile from England, and he was recently on Dan Senor's podcast, Call Me Back, which is all about an analysis of what's going on in Israel today. I highly recommend it with some level of reservation because I don't agree with everything that's on the podcast, but there are many, many really, really good things. Recently, he had this fellow, Andrew Roberts, and I'm just provide a snippet of his article. Much of the international condemnation of Donald Trump's Riviera plan for Gaza rests on the assumption that the Palestinians retain sovereignty over the territory, despite all the events that have taken place since their incursion into Israel on October 7th, 23, and that they also continue to have the right to choose their own government. In fact, historical precedent suggests that Hamas's invasion of southern Israel that day and its condign punishment by the Israeli Defense Forces have severe implications for whether the Gazans still have the right to decide their own destiny and who governs them. For again and again in the past, peoples who unleash unprovoked aggressive wars against their neighbors and are then defeated, as the Gazans have been on any conceivable metric, lose either their government or their sovereignty, or both. It would be strange were Hamas somehow to buck this historical trend. I skip a lot in the handout that you have in front of you, but he gives several examples in recent history. He starts off with the two Boer republics of southern Africa, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. When they invaded the British colonies of Natal and Cape Colony in October of 1899, a war broke out that 2.5 years later they had comprehensively lost. By the peace treaty of Eringing in May 1902, both republics were annexed by the British and lost their sovereignty entirety, their government having already fled for Holland. Another example, Konrad Heinlein was the Nazi leader of the Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia in 1938. He invited Hitler to invade the Czech state in 1939. He had much the same kind of willing acolyte relationship with the Fuhrer that Yahya Sinwar had with Iran. When the Second World War was lost in 1945, Heinlein committed suicide and his people were moved out of the Sudetenland, some 800,000 to the Soviet zone and to the rest of West Germany. The Sudetenland was then entirely repopulated with ethnic Czechs. Okay, another example. The decision of the Vichy government of France to fight against Britain in the Second World War with bombing raids on Gibraltar and open warfare in Syria so delegitimized it that when the liberation of France took place on D-Day in June 1944, it was swept aside and sovereignty was instead given to the Free French, who returned with the Allies. The legitimately elected government of France under the Marshal plan was thus overflown and replaced by the chosen government of the incoming conquering allies. After North Korea launched its vicious, unprovoked attack on South Korea in June 1950, it was punished so severely by the American-led United Nations force that it lost over 1 million dead. North Korea lost territory in the armistice in 1953 and has been a pariah state ever since. When the Argentinian military dictatorship suddenly invaded the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic in April 1982 and were utterly defeated 10 weeks later by Margaret Thatcher's task force, the entire junta in Buenos Aires was deposed from power, some were jailed, and democracy returned to Argentina. There are thus profound consequences for governments involved in launching unprovoked wars, and they cannot expect to stay in power when they have brought down death, destruction, and defeat upon their people. He then quotes from Saddam Hussein's surprise attack on Kuwait is a similar example of when a country invades its neighbor suddenly and without provocation, and then after defeat in war loses both its government, Saddam was hanged, and its sovereignty, while the US-led coalition attempted to rebuild the country. The collapse of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, Serb leaders such as Slobodan Milosevic, General Ratko Mladic, and Radovan Karadzic took the cold-blooded decision to invade neighboring Bosnia and conduct an appalling program of what came to be known as ethnic cleansing. Those critics of Donald Trump who tritely referred to the population transfers under his Gaza plan as ethnic cleansing ought to revisit what the phrase actually means in terms of horror, violence, and bloodshed. And he goes on and on and on with several examples of this. And finally, on the issue of Yesh Am Mefuzar Umfurad Bein Ha'amim, a nation that is divided, that needs Mishloach Manot and Matanot Le'evunim to reunite them. I will just quote for you from a recent Times of Israel article that was based on a Haaretz article about one of the Lily Albag, who was one of the released hostages, says that one of the things that the captors of Hamas did to the hostages regularly was to try to demoralize them by telling them, not only do your people not care about you, but they're fighting amongst themselves more than they're fighting against Hamas. And as long as the Israelis fight among themselves, you have no chance of victory, and you're going to be here for the rest of your life. And she writes that that was one of the most painful things that she experienced, was knowing that there were some people who wanted her to be free, and others who were willing to forego her freedom, and that there was this kind of strife in Israel that was causing Hamas to prevail in the war. And I think that's a very, very important example. If there's anything that we want to be able to apply from the Purim story to the modern day, is that whatever we can possibly do to stay united despite all of our disagreements and all of our different views on all things under the sun, whether it's religious disagreements, political disagreements, what to do, what Israel should do or shouldn't do, which candidates should win the Canadian elections, should Canada become the 51st state, should it fight against the United States, or who should win the elections. All of these things are so unimportant in the large scale of things that Jewish people have to stay united. So that's something that I think I'll leave you with. And I think the rest is, I believe, is really up to all of you, all of us, to be able to continue to try to mine the lessons of the Megillah, especially these last few chapters, and try to apply them to the real world. Questions, comments? Anyone have anything that jump out at them? Anything jump out at you? Yes, Leon.
After the events in the Megillah, did Achashverosh continue to support the Jews, or did he turn on the Jews? Might be a modern possibility also.
Yeah, it's always possible. We don't know what happens, although we have no indication. You know, Achashverosh's son, according to tradition, is Koresh, is Cyrus, and he's the precursor to the rebuilding of the temple, the builder of the second temple. Yeah, so maybe, you know, maybe Trump's grandson, who's probably Jewish, who is Jewish, maybe one of Trump's grandchildren will be the builder of the third Beis HaMikdash. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Especially because he goes to the modern Orthodox school.
That's right. So he's probably a religious Zionist. Yeah.
Make Israel great again.
Make Israel great again. Yeah. Make the temple great again. Yeah. Okay, what else? What else should we extract from the Megillah? Yes, Karen. Yes, please.
Weeks ago, she said that one of the most united times that we were in Israel is on the day of the Bibas children being returned, and when they found out that Shiri's body wasn't there. The whole country was together and united.
Right.
And that same day, there was supposed to be a bus bombings all throughout the country. And in that united, and she made the points, just like in the united, when they called and they gather all the Jews together to.
Leis kenoset kol haYehudim. Yes.
And so similarly, that we were saved because of our united.
We saved. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, absolutely amazing. There are no coincidences. And the fact that this happened, many people have observed. We don't know God's ways, but it certainly could have been a kapara that prevented that terrible tragedy from happening, and really create a miracle that was a terrible tragedy was averted. Yeah. Yes, Michelle.
In the last pasuk of Parakid, I have a question where it says, Mordechai Yehudi Mishnah Melech Hashpashim V'Oledim V'Ratzui Lerov Echav. I don't remember like what the issue, like they were, like you translated here. Oh, he was very popular.
Yes, he was
But
very
it says
popular.
here, Lerov Echav, is there
Yeah.
something?
Yes, there is. Yeah, the Gemara in Masechet Megillah tells us that there are two ways, by the way, to read the word rov. Rov could just mean an abundance of his brethren. But the Gemara reads it as rov, meaning a majority of his brethren. And that teaches us that Parshu Mimenu Miksata Sanhedrin, that a portion of the Sanhedrin dissented from him. They basically did not want to be associated anymore with Mordechai. And why is that? Because they felt that someone who sits on the Sanhedrin, pasnish, that he should be sitting with the leaders in the cabinet, in the parliament in Persia. You know, when you're supposed to be a member of the Sanhedrin, you're supposed to be above all of that. And so they felt that he had gotten too mired, too involved in politics, and it was dragging him down. And if they continued to associate with him, that would drag them down as well. So I just want to make an interesting observation. There's a beautiful vort from the Chassam Sofer on that very pasuk, and thank you for reminding me of it. V'ratzui l'rov echav, v'lo l'kol echav, and not to all of his brethren. So the Chassam Sofer simply asks a very basic question. If Chazal are correct, then why end the Megillah on such a sour note about Mordechai? Like, everything's great. Achashverosh is powerful. He can wage attacks upon the entire country. And Mordechai Yehudi Mishneh LaMelech Achashverosh V'gadol HaYehudim. Oh, and by the way, V'ratzui only l'rov echav. Only most of the Jews. So is that really a good way to end off the Megillah? So the Chassam Sofer says, yes, it is. Because Mordechai's greatest strength was that he had his detractors. You know, if someone is so popular that they never have anyone calling them out on anything, that's a recipe for disaster. You know what kept Mordechai on his toes? It was the guy in the back of the shul who said, "You call that a drasha?" Right? Yeah, like Moshe Rabbeinu, the same thing. And the Chassam Sofer, he says, so that it's not ending off on a sour note. It's ending off on a positive note, that was Mordechai's key to success, because it always kept him on his toes, because he knew he had to be on the watch constantly. And not only that, but the Chassam Sofer says that's the meaning of the vort, where we say that, you know, Zacha Kenegdo, Zacha Ezer, Lo Zacha Kenegdo. You know, Eve is called an Ezer Kenegdo, a helpmate opposing her husband. So either she's a helpmate or she's opposing. So the Chazal say, Zacha Ezer. If a man is meritorious, his wife will be his helpmate. If he is not meritorious, she will be against him. But the Chassam Sofer says that in both cases, a husband is enriched by his wife. Because if he's a good boy, she'll give him a pat on the head and say, "You're such a good boy." And if he's not a good boy, she will be always there to point it out so that he will be able to improve from his wife's gentle and loving criticism, kenegdo. And so that's the best way for a marriage to subsist, is for there always to be checks and balances within the marriage, so that if a man is good, his wife is there to compliment him. If he's not doing good, she's there to offer him criticism. And that's the biggest bracha you can ask for in a spouse. Okay, anything else before we call it a night? All right.